All right, here we are, Diane, Rico again. Today we want to talk about embracing failure. Um, Failure is ultimately a part of leadership, and it's something that we have to model as leaders and just as people in general, where failure is okay, and that it doesn't mean the end of the world. So today we're going to share a couple of stories that we have about big risks we took, failure, and how it can cause worry, but ultimately it just made us better. So yeah, Diane, I'd love to hear your story. I mean, we were talking about earlier stories of failure. So do you want to get into it?
Yeah. Yeah. So when we were talking about this, the first thing that came to mind was my first huge failure that I had in my career. It was probably, I don't know, it was less than a year into my career. We had undertaken this huge redesign, rebuild of our entire website, and we had different teams working on different pieces. And mine was the admin the admin section, like the whole admin tools. And I even remember the name of it. It was like the Universal Management Console, like the UMC project. And it was this huge thing. And I remember I was so excited about it because I was chosen to, I was a newbie beginning of my career. I was like, yes, I can actually prove myself here and make a difference and do something meaningful on this project. And we were put in a conference room for 9 months, and we worked crazy hours with this promise that we could get a bonus at the end. And 9 months later, we weren't even done yet. They scrapped the whole entire thing. I think it wasn't our president, but whoever was making the decisions about this project or even decided to do it in the first place, he was fired, and they just told us to stop and then go back to what we were doing before. It was like, are you kidding me? I put my heart and soul and everything into this, and now we're just scrapping it. It felt like everything I was doing meant nothing,
Yeah. What were some of the biggest takeaways from that project?
Yeah. Luckily I did have a really awesome mentor at the time who had been through a big failure like that. And he was just like, this is like, everyone has a story like this, and you're actually lucky that you've been through this now, and you learn what it's like to work on a failed project. And so I did have that hint of like optimism going into this, like, what do we do now world after that, because I didn't know what work was going to be like if we weren't working on the UMC project anymore. But it was, just like realizing that it didn't mean that we did anything wrong. Of course, there was tons that we learned from it and how we would do things differently. We went from a waterfall software development culture to agile, and that was a huge culture shift. There was a lot of resistance around that. So, but it did provide the momentum and the argument for moving to this other way of doing things. And that was, for the next 2 years that I was there, that was our mission. We were just like, yeah, we're not going back to the way things were. So it ended up being great, and it showed us what we needed to adjust as a team.
But how has it changed? Just like, so you said that happened earlier in your career, and how, if it did, how has it changed like your approach to work and leading and coaching and all that in general?
Yeah. Well, in terms of when there's a project on my team that's not going well, I haven't always been the one in charge of deciding what to work on or how we're going to approach it and what the priorities are and things. But it doesn't, when a project is not going well, it doesn't make me think less of the people who are working on it. It's, I think it's easy to see like, oh, there's this team over here they're just struggling. They can't get this out, or there's just tons of bugs, or it's not what people want even. And it's easy to just blame that team, especially if it's happened more than once over a course of time. But I think it's a signal of something else that needs to change. It's not that they're bad employees or that they need to necessarily like up level or anything. It's usually about process and priorities and decision making, which a lot of times ICs aren't able to change that easily without leadership's input.
Right. And we talked a little bit about before we started recording about the it's a 10-year-old article now, the Etsy article about blameless postmortems, right? It's sounds very much like how you're talking about things you took away from this project.
Yeah, I think it's easy to see like a one-off situation, especially if it's like something really bad, to see it as like, oh, that person just made a mistake, And I know you're telling me your story, which I think would be great for everyone to hear. But it's like, especially if there's only one person working on it, or they're like the sole person in charge making decisions about it. And that's just not the case. Like we usually would do 5 whys, and I really like that because it takes you from the surface level. Oh, this is what it looks like is going wrong. But like, let's go 5 levels deeper and find out really like what is the very bottom piece that enabled this to even happen in the first place.
Right.
So I'm curious, like, I think your example is perfect for that. Did you guys do anything like that?
Yeah. So
tell me what happened again.
Yeah, I'll get into my story. It's an interesting one. And I guess so for me the takeaway from mine is not only that is where like could we have stopped and asked those questions sooner? Because I think there was 3 of us leading different parts of the project.
Okay.
So there was like Chris Jaffe, who's the PM. This is me on the content and creative side, and then there was a designer, UX lead that was put on. And any one of us could have really put the brakes on this project and asked those questions, but we didn't. And so let me get into the story, and I'll tell you how it went. And I use this story a lot because people tend to be afraid to take risks, and they're afraid if they lose their company money that they'll get fired or something like that. Yeah. And so before I tell the story, this was probably a third of the way into my Netflix career, and I still had like 6 more years after this incident. So it was, I forget what year it was, but it was when Chromecast and AirPlay were relatively new. And so we thought casting was going to be a huge part of our business. And there was this project called Memento that was almost like Amazon X-Ray that we were working on in parallel while Amazon was doing this. Long story short, we spent 18 months doing quals, research. We did design sprints. We traveled and talked to people all over the world and all these things. And we used engineering resources to prototype. We built all this up. And ultimately, it was not a big enough part of, like, casting ended up being a minuscule part of our business, not what we thought it would be. So 18 months later, Chris Jaffe decided to pull the plug on it. And so the three of us, the ones I mentioned earlier, went in front of the whole product organization and just admitted failure.
Wow.
We said, hey, we wasted about $2 million in resources, 18 months of research, all this stuff, and we're cutting bait. We're stopping the project because it's not going to be a significant part of the business. And it was one of those things, like, we were terrified to have the conversation, because you think that's one of those things, you lose a company $2 million and then, like, whose head's going to roll? Ultimately, nobody's head rolled. Chris went on to, he's the chief design officer at YouTube. I was there for another 6 years. The designer moved on to be the chief design officer at Twitter. Not the Twitter today, but the Twitter before.
Old Twitter.
And so, like, everyone went on to be relatively successful in their careers. So the takeaway was, even though that we lost a lot of money, there was great work that the engineering team did, and our teams did around, like, computer vision, AI, that led to other things. But we didn't necessarily see that as we were doing it. And so our main thing was, we focused on the failure so much that we didn't realize the risks that we took actually contributed to bigger parts of the business. And that's what, so when we took it to the product organization, it was inspiring for us to see other people in the group, in the working group, say, no, this wasn't a failure because we were able to do this. It unlocked this and unlocked this and unlocked this. So my moral of the story is, failure doesn't always lead to heads rolling.
Yeah.
And often and it's cliche, but learning from the mistakes and looking at what you actually built and how can you leverage that in other ways, became a more powerful learning coming out of that.
Yeah.
So I use that story all the time. And even for the next 6 years, when my direct reports would say, like, I'm afraid to take a risk, I'm like, look, I lost the company $2 million. There's no bigger risk you're going to take. So go for it. And if it doesn't work out, we'll figure out what we learned and how we can use it in the future.
Right. I love that. How did you get to that place? Like, how quick did you get there from having that meeting where you admit, or even deciding that you're gonna go with your team members and admit to everyone that we're pulling the plug? From that moment, you knew that was going to happen until you felt good about it.
Yeah. It took us 2 weeks of, like, tons of anxiety, right? And we just put it on the calendar when we're going to tell everyone. We're like, hey, we had weekly strat for all the product innovation teams. So, like, 2 weeks, we have this 20-minute slot during product strat, and this is when we're going to tell everyone.
Wow.
And so, high anxiety. And it wasn't until the end of that 20-minute block where everybody was like, what I was telling you, we actually were able to do this. And other parts of the product team started to champion for us. We're like, no, this product was not for nothing.
Wow.
And that's where, we started to be humbled. We're like, well, thank you for seeing that and recognizing that. And then we started to realize, like, yeah, even though the primary project was a failed project, all the secondary projects that were born from it added so much more value to the business.
I love that.
Yeah. So that's where, I mean, our egos took a hit for sure. And it was hard to do, but the fact that everybody else kind of spoke up for us and kind of not came to our rescue, but, like, stated the other value that we brought, that helped make it easier.
Yeah. I think that says a lot about the culture that was there at the time, because at the company I was working at during that huge failure, there were no conversations like that. It was just like, everyone stood up from their cubicles one day when the top dog came in and said, effective immediately, this project is over. And they said that so-and-so is no longer working for the company. And that was all that was said. There was no conversation about like, okay, what do big projects look like now? And it ended up being a great thing. We completely changed how we developed software, but it was never acknowledged that it came out of that and that it was actually a really good thing. So I think that's amazing that you were in that situation where they actually saw and talked about the value and the learnings and all of that.
Yeah, was definitely, it went, because of that, it went a little bit easier. I mean, it's hard just to admit it, right? Like at the time, the Neil Hunt, the chief product officer, was there. Greg Peters, who's like the co-CEO now, I think, like they were all in there, and we had to talk about these things. But yeah, like, you're right. I mean, the culture was unique in the way that was accepted. But it's also good to hear from your story that there was learning that came out of it. Because the worst thing is, out of failure, you just accept failure.
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing. It's okay to accept failure, but also, what is it going to teach you? What are you going to learn from it?
Yeah, I know. It could have been, according to it, or it looked like on the surface that from a business standpoint that they felt it was the person in charge. It was that one decision to even do it in the first place was the problem, which wasn't really,
Yeah.
in that way, possibly. But we didn't, at that time, we were a waterfall and we didn't know really that there was another way.
Yeah. So what was some of the lessons that you took away about failure that maybe changed the way you look at failure?
Well, I don't know if it was particularly from that, but that was a big one. But I think I've had a lot of really big failures in my life, at work and personal. So it's interesting. It doesn't feel good ever. It never feels good. But there's this moment where you start to get excited about, okay, what's next after this? Because it's like when everything falls apart, it has to be rebuilt again in one way or another. And I'm personally not going to rebuild it exactly the same as before,
Mm-hmm.
So that something better is coming, and you don't know what that is yet. You don't know what it looks like, maybe because you haven't been able to really see like those positive things yet. Like you were saying, you were probably in such anxiety about the fact that it was a failure. You didn't see all of those amazing things that came out of it quite yet. And just knowing that something like that is coming, you just can't quite put your finger on it at the moment. But now it doesn't feel good while it's happening, but just knowing and having that, like, yeah, everything is going to be fine, and better than fine, actually. It's going to be better than it is right now during this failure.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, it's like failure is just part of leadership. It's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
I don't know anyone, and if you try to make everything perfect, you're not going to do anything great. Like that's what I would tell my teams, right? Like if you are afraid of failure, then you're not going to take big swings, and you won't do anything great. But also, like, how would you know what amazing success feels like if you don't know what failure feels like, right? Like you need to know both ends of the spectrum. So those are things that like I really took away, and why I sort of embrace failure. And then one last thing is, why I think a lot of people are afraid of failure is because like this idea of worry, right? And I may have mentioned this to you before, but I've been pulling a lot of inspiration from the Mark Twain quote, "Worry is paying a debt you don't owe."
I love that.
It's almost like 99% of the things that I've worried about all the way since I was a kid never happened.
Yeah.
Right? It's just a worry I had. I've never been homeless. I've never been, and like these are things that I worry about. Like, I haven't this not humble brags or stuff like that, but like I've never been fired. I've never been homeless. I've never like been broke. I've never been, but those are the things that I've
Yeah.
always been afraid of, but they never happened. Right?
I love the one about being fired. Like how many times have we worried about being fired, or our bosses think that we're doing a bad job? I know this is a common thing. Like I like putting that pressure on yourself
mhm.
to do more or do things perfect because of what you think might happen if you don't. And it has never, we think that the worry is helping us do like, oh, I need to make sure I'm working later or harder or whatever because I'm not doing good enough right now. We think that that's helping us, but have we ever tested that theory? Like, what happens if you just don't worry about it and just do the best that you can?
Yeah. And what about the person who's been working there for 8 years?
Right?
Right? Did you worry the entire 8 years? And so
Yeah.
you have 8 years of history saying you were not fired. So what's
Yeah.
tomorrow? What's different about tomorrow
Yeah.
than the past 8 years? Right?
But your brain like is like, well, maybe it's because you always like made up for it somehow. Like, I don't know.
Yeah. Like it's been 5,000 days. Tomorrow's the day it's going to
That
happen.
tomorrow's the day. This project is the one that is going to
Yeah.
just ruin everything.
Yeah. Amazing. So I think on that note, that is a great note to leave it on is worry is paying debt you don't know. If nothing has happened to you so far, what makes you think it's going to happen tomorrow? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing.
You can lose the company $2 million and still work there for 6 years.
Right. Exactly. And for you, you can have a failed project like in the first year of your career and still be a VP of,
Right.
right, later on down the line. So failure, embrace it. It's going to happen. If you're afraid of it, don't be. Most of the things you're afraid of don't actually happen.
Yeah.
So, all right. We'll see you all next time. Thanks, Diane.
Thanks.